She was scraping his face off the canvas for the third time that week, and still her hand would not give him his own eyes. The palette knife made a sound like tearing linen as Rosalind Colford drew it down through wet paint, through the Duke of Rivenhall's carefully modelled cheekbone, through the beginning of a mouth she had gotten exactly right on the first attempt. She did not touch the eyes. She never had to. The eyes were always the first thing wrong, and the last thing she was willing to destroy, because some small, stubborn part of her kept insisting, against all evidence and against the sitter's own patient face not 4 feet away, that they were correct. That the grey she had mixed, storm grey, ringed at the center with a thread of gold like sun breaking low through cloud, was the true color of him, and it was the living man who had gotten it wrong. "You've killed him again," the Duke observed, without heat, from the chair by the window where he had not moved in over an hour. "I have," Rosalind agreed, and did not apologize, because 6 sittings in, she had learned he did not want apologies. He wanted to understand. That, of the 2 things a patron could want from a portraitist, was by far the more dangerous. She set the knife down, before her hand could betray her further. Behind her, propped on the workbench her father had built with his own hands, and left to her, along with his name, and his debts, and his silence, a small board, no larger than a folded letter, watched the room with a single, unfinished study. 2 eyes, storm grey, gold-ringed, painted by someone else's hand, decades before Rosalind had been born, in a color she had never consciously chosen, and could not seem to stop reaching for. She had asked her father once, years ago, why he kept it. He had told her it was to teach her patience. He had never once told her whose eyes they were, and now he never could, because he had been 6 months in the churchyard at St. Aldwyn's and had taken the answer with him. She did not yet know that the answer was sitting 11 feet away from her, in a wing-back chair, wearing a signet ring he'd inherited too young, and a face he had spent 11 years believing was entirely his own. 6 months earlier, before any of this, before the letter with the ducal seal, before Rivenhall, before she had learned that a man could sit still enough and long enough to become a kind of mirror, Rosalind had been a woman, doing a dead man's work under a dead man's name, and doing it, she told herself daily, rather well. Elias Colford had been modestly celebrated in 3 counties as a portraitist of unfussy, honest likenesses. A man who painted merchants' wives as though they were duchesses, and duchesses as though they might, under the right light, be capable of kindness. What the 3 counties had not known, and what Rosalind was careful they should go on not knowing, was that for the better part of 2 years before his death, and every commission since, the hand behind E. Colford, portraitist, had belonged to his daughter. It was not vanity that kept the deception running. It was arithmetic, a guild that would not admit her, patrons who would pay a fair price for a Colford, and half that for a Miss Colford, and a good number who would pay nothing at all, on principle, for a woman's hand at anything so serious as a face meant to hang for 3 generations. She had inherited her father's brushes, his eye, his patience, and his surname, and she used all 4 the way a soldier uses whatever weapon is put in his hand, without sentiment, because the alternative was not painting at all. She signed her letters R. Colford. She kept her hair pinned close, and her sleeves unfashionably plain, and let people assume whatever initial suited them. She had grown so practiced at the small, constant vigilance of it, the flattened voice in company, the deliberate refusal to blush at a compliment, the habit of speaking of "my father's methods" as though he were only recently and temporarily absent from the room, that she sometimes forgot, for whole afternoons, that she was performing anything at all. She had not expected the ruse to survive contact with a duke. The letter had come by private courier, which ought to have warned her before she'd broken the seal. Tradesmen's correspondence did not arrive by private courier. It requested, in a hand so controlled it looked printed, the presence of Mr. R. Colford at Rivenhall, at his earliest convenience, to discuss a commission of some delicacy, the particulars of which his Grace preferred to explain in person. "A duke," said Tobias, who had been Elias Colford's errand boy, and was now, by a promotion, neither of them had ever formally discussed, Rosalind's, once father's, once your, face on a canvas. "He wants a portraitist," Rosalind corrected, folding the letter along its existing creases with more care than it required. "He does not yet know which one he's getting. You'll go as yourself." "I'll go as R. Colford," she said, "which is myself." "It simply isn't all of myself." She looked at the boy, who was 14 and too clever by half, and the only person alive who knew both her secrets. The trade one, and though he'd never said so aloud, the grief-shaped hole, where a father used to stand behind her chair correcting her line. "You'll mind the shop. If Mr. Price comes round again asking whether Colford's daughter has finally given up her father's easel to a proper painter, tell him Colford's daughter is at Rivenhall, executing a ducal commission, and he is welcome to leave his card." Tobias grinned, delighted, and did not ask the question she could see forming behind his eyes, whether she was afraid. She was. She had been afraid since her father's coffin went into the ground and left her alone with his name, and no one to tell her whether she was using it rightly. But fear, like grief, was not useful material, and she had long ago decided to spend her attention on things that were. She arrived at Rivenhall on a grey morning in early spring with a trunk of pigments, 3 prepared canvases, and a letter of introduction that would, if read carefully, deceive no one, and, if read the way most men read such letters, deceive everyone. The housekeeper who met her at the side entrance, servant's business went in by the side, and Rosalind had long since stopped minding, since it meant fewer people to perform for, was a broad, brisk woman, with flower still pale on one wrist, who introduced herself as Mrs. Yardley, and looked Rosalind over with the frank, unhurried assessment of someone who had spent 30 years deciding at a glance whether a stranger meant trouble for her kitchen. "You're smaller than I pictured a Colford," Mrs. Yardley said. "I'm told that often. His Grace is in the long gallery. He likes to look at the old portraits before he sits for a new one. Says it puts him in a humble frame of mind." Mrs. Yardley's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Between us, I don't think humility's ever troubled him much, but far be it from me to argue with a duke about his own gallery." The long gallery at Rivenhall ran the length of the west wing, hung floor to cornice with 200 years of Calthorpes in wigs, in armour, in the stiff brocade of vanished decades, and Rosalind walked its length with the particular hunger of a painter who had trained on second-hand canvases and borrowed colour, cataloguing brushwork the way another woman might catalogue jewels. She was 3/4 of the way down, deep in the study of a Van Dyck school hand on a countess's sleeve, when she became aware that she was not alone, and that the man standing near the gallery's far window had been watching her look rather longer than politeness required. He was tall in the unhurried way of men who had never had to make themselves noticed, dressed with a plainness that on anyone else would have read as economy, and on him read as simple disinterest in the question, and he had, she noted with the reflexive, cataloguing part of her mind that never entirely switched off. A face that would be a genuine pleasure to paint, and an absolute misery to paint correctly, strong-boned, guarded, built for stillness rather than expression, the kind of face that told a portraitist nothing, and a patient one, eventually, everything. "Mr. Colford," he said, not a question. She had rehearsed this moment for 2 days on the road, and it still cost her something to hold his gaze evenly and not correct him. "Your Grace." If he heard anything unusual in her voice, he gave no sign. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at correspondence, at accounts, at anything requiring a decision and not a feeling, thoroughly, briefly, and then set aside for the matter at hand. "You come well recommended," he said. "Lord Aysgarth's wife, and before that, I understand, half the alderman of Bath. I'm told your father had a gift for painting a man as he wished to be remembered rather than merely as he was, without ever once flattering him. I'm told the son has the same gift." "The son," Rosalind said, and felt the word sit strangely in her mouth, even after 2 years of practice, "does his best." "Good." He turned, at last, from the window and gestured her the length of the gallery with an economy of motion that told her he was a man unaccustomed to being kept waiting and equally unaccustomed to admitting it. "I want to be direct with you, Mr. Colford, since I understand painters value the same honesty they claim to render. I am to be married within the year. My betrothed's family wishes for a formal portrait to mark the occasion. The Rivenhall likeness that will hang beside my father's, and his father's before him. I do not particularly care to sit for it. I am told I must. I would like the man holding the brush to be someone who will not waste either of our time, flattering a face that does not require it, and does not especially want it improved upon." "That," said Rosalind, already reaching for the small sketchbook she kept in her coat pocket, the old habit rising in her before she had consciously decided to indulge it, "is the only kind of commission I know how to execute." He looked for the first time, faintly amused, not a smile, nothing so generous as that, but something in the set of his mouth eased by a degree she suspected very few people were permitted to see. "Then we shall get on," he said, "extremely well." She did not, in that first hour in the long gallery, see anything of herself in him, nor he, so far as she could tell, anything of anyone in her. He was simply a commission, difficult, exacting, worth the fee and worth, she admitted privately, the challenge of a face built for concealment. It would be another 6 sittings before either of them understood that the gallery they stood in, full of 200 years of painted Calthorpes, was missing one portrait that mattered more than all the others combined, and that the woman standing beside him with a sketchbook and a false name was the only living person who could have painted it from memory, though she did not yet know she carried the memory at all. The first 3 sittings passed in the ordinary rhythm of the trade. The Duke arranged in his father's old chair by the north-facing window, where the light fell without flattery or cruelty, Rosalind at her easel a careful 8 feet distant, the silence between them broken only by the small sounds of the work itself, charcoal on prepared canvas, the scrape of a palette knife, the Duke's occasional dry observation on whatever correspondence he'd brought to occupy the parts of his mind that sitting still did not require. It was on the 4th sitting that she first noticed she had done it wrong. She had blocked in the eyes from memory of the 3rd session, confident in her hand, and stepped back to compare canvas to sitter, and found, with the small cold lurch that any painter knows when the model refuses to match the work, that she had painted them grey where his were. She checked twice, moving closer than strict propriety liked, close enough that he raised one eyebrow at her, a perfectly ordinary hazel brown, warm and unremarkable, and entirely unlike the storm grey she had laid down with such unthinking certainty. "Something the matter?" the Duke asked. "I've made an error in the underpainting," she said, which was true, and did not explain that the error troubled her less for its inaccuracy than for how little it had felt like one while she was making it. She scraped the offending pigment away and began again, this time watching his face with the deliberate, almost aggressive attention of someone correcting a fault, and produced, on the 2nd attempt, a passable hazel that satisfied neither her memory nor, strangely, her eye. By the sixth sitting, it had happened 3 more times, and she had begun, privately, to dread the moment each session when she would step back to compare the work against the man and find that her hand, left to its own devices for even a few unguarded minutes, had drifted back toward grey. "You keep frowning at me as though I've disappointed you," the Duke said, on the 6th sitting, not looking up from the letter in his lap. "You have," Rosalind said, before she could soften it. "Your eyes won't hold still." That got his full attention, which she had not intended and rather regretted, since his full attention, she was learning, was not a comfortable thing to be the object of. He set the letter aside. "I assure you, they're the same 2 eyes I arrived with." "I don't doubt it," she said, and because there was no way to explain the truth without sounding either mad or incompetent, she said instead, "It's a fault in my hand, not in your face. Painters develop them. A tendency to correct towards some private idea of a color, rather than the color that's actually in front of them." This was, as far as it went, true. She simply did not know where the private idea had come from, or why it insisted on a shade of grey she had never seen, except on the small board her father had left nailed above his workbench, a board she had not thought of in weeks and found herself thinking of now, with an unease she could not name. "And is the fault correcting itself?" "No," she admitted. "It's getting worse." He studied her for a moment with an expression she would come, over the following weeks, to recognize as his listening face, the one that gave away nothing, but meant he had filed something away to be examined later, alone, at his leisure. "My mother," he said, apropos of nothing she could see, "used to say that a painter's hand knows things before the painter does. She was fond of that sort of pronouncement. I never put much stock in it. And now?" "Now," he said, and picked his letter back up, closing the subject as neatly as he'd opened it. "I find myself less certain than I was this morning." She did not know, that evening, packing her brushes by candlelight in the small chamber Mrs. Yardley had given her in the unfashionable end of the house, that the Duke of Rivenhall had gone up to his own rooms and stood for a long while in front of a small, unremarkable watercolor he kept in a drawer rather than on a wall, a woman's face, unfinished, painted by an amateur hand some 20-odd years before he was born, and that he had not, in that quiet hour, connected it to the portraitist downstairs at all, only that something in the shape of the day had unsettled him in a way he could not yet name, the way a man feels a draught before he thinks to look for the open window. Hollis Renfrew arrived at Rivenhall 11 days into the commission, uninvited by anyone but himself, on the pretext of paying his respects to an old friend of his cousin's family, and Rosalind disliked him within the first quarter hour with the swift, unexamined instinct she had learned to trust more than she trusted most considered judgments. He was a handsome man, in the depleted way of someone who had spent handsomeness carelessly for 20 years and was only now beginning to notice the balance running low, good bones going soft at the jaw, good clothes cut a season behind the fashion he clearly still believed himself to be setting. He found her in the gallery, working from a preliminary study while the Duke was occupied with his steward, and made a show of admiring her materials before he'd so much as glanced at the canvas. "Colford," he said, reading the name off the letter of introduction she had left, with careless propriety, on the corner of her work table. "I knew an Elias Colford. Painted my late aunt. Must be, good heavens, 20 years gone now. Competent hand. Sentimental about his subjects, though. Always made them look kinder than God had actually made them. My father," Rosalind said, with the particular stillness she reserved for strangers who mentioned him carelessly, believed kindness was a fact worth painting, when he found it. "His son, then? You've his coloring." Renfrew's eyes moved over her with a slow, cataloguing thoroughness that had nothing to do with painting at all, and something in it made her want a wall at her back. Odd. I don't recall Elias Colford ever mentioning a son. He mentioned a great many things to a great many people, sir, and confided the whole of his business to none of them. I found that discretion, on the whole, was good for the trade. Discretion? Renfrew smiled, showing teeth that had once been very good. Yes, I imagine it would be. He let the silence sit a beat too long, in the manner of a man accustomed to making people uncomfortable and enjoying the small proof of his own power in it, and then turned the subject with the ease of long practice. And how does His Grace find you? Difficult subject, I'd imagine. Rivenhall was always a closed sort of boy. Closed sort of man, now. He sits well, Rosalind said. He doesn't fidget. No, Renfrew agreed, already moving toward the door. Already, she understood without being able to prove it, filing this whole encounter away for some later use she could not yet see the shape of. He never did care to be looked at too closely. Runs in the family, that. Some people are better off not examined. He paused at the threshold, and for just a moment the practiced charm dropped away entirely, leaving something colder and more assessing underneath it. "Good day, Mr. Colford. I dare say we'll meet again." She did not like the way he said her false name, as though he were testing its weight and finding it too light for what it was meant to cover. She did not know, that afternoon, that Hollis Renfrew had spent the better part of 22 years making a comfortable, unearned living off the careful maintenance of a lie considerably larger than hers, and that something in her face, a resemblance she could not see in her own mirror because she had never had cause to look for it, had just handed him the first cold thread of a fear he had not felt in over a decade. The private space near Discovery came on a wet afternoon 9 days later, when a sudden downpour trapped Rosalind in the long gallery long after the day's sitting had ended, the Duke having stepped out to see a tenant matter settled before the rain worsened, leaving her alone among 200 years of painted Calthorpes, with nothing to do but wait out the weather and look. She found the portrait by accident, in the sense that any painter's eye is drawn eventually and inevitably to the one canvas in a room that does not match its neighbors, smaller than the family portraits around it, unsigned, hung in a shadowed alcove near the gallery's end, as though someone had once meant to move it and never gotten round to finishing the thought. A young woman, painted perhaps 25 years past, in the fashion of a different decade, with a face Rosalind found herself studying, with the same helpless, hungry attention she gave any well-made portrait. And then, with a small, cold jolt she felt in her hands before her mind caught up to it, with a great deal more attention than that. The eyes were grey, storm grey, ringed at the center with a thread of gold. She was still standing in front of it, sketchbook forgotten at her side, when the Duke found her there, 20 minutes later, rain-damp and distracted, and came to stand beside her without a word, the two of them looking at the small, unsigned portrait together, in a silence that felt, to Rosalind, oddly loaded, though she could not have said with what. "You've found her," he said finally. "I don't know who she is." "Neither, entirely, do I." He did not look away from the canvas. "My mother's dearest friend. Nearer a sister than a friend, by every account I ever heard. They came out the same season, married the same year, within a county of each other. She used to visit when I was a boy. I remember almost nothing about her clearly, except that she had a way of listening to a child, as though he were saying something worth the trouble, which even my own mother, God rest her, did not always manage. And I remember her eyes, because I used to try to draw them, badly, in the margins of my lesson books, and never once got them right. What happened to her? She died. Or that's the story I was given, and I was 7, and children believe what they're told. Something moved behind his careful stillness, brief and unguarded, gone again almost before she registered it. There was a fire, I'm told, at a house she was visiting some distance from here. My mother never spoke of it again after the news came, not once, not even at the end of her own life when she spoke of a great many things she'd kept silent for years. I found this in a trunk of her things after she died. It isn't finished. I don't know why it was never finished, or why it was never hung properly, or why no one in this family, in 20 years, has ever once said the woman's name in my hearing. Rosalind looked at the unfinished eyes, at the color she had been fighting her own hand over for a fortnight, and felt something in her chest that she could not name, and did not, yet, have any reason to examine. Only a strange, cold certainty that she had seen this exact unfinished quality of grey somewhere before, on a board no larger than a folded letter, nailed above a workbench in a shop 3 counties away, and that the not knowing of it sat in her like a held breath. "What was her name?" she asked. The Duke was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Evelina," he said at last, as though the word cost him something to spend. "Lady Evelina Denholm." He did not see her hand go still on the edge of her sketchbook. He was looking at the portrait, not at her, and so he missed the moment, small, private, gone in an instant, when the name landed somewhere in Rosalind that had no memory to attach it to and reacted anyway, the way a struck bell rings whether or not anyone in the room knows the note. She told herself, walking back to her chamber through the emptying rainlight of the corridor, that it was nothing, a painter's overactive sympathy for a stranger's grief, a coincidence of color, no more improbable than any other trick her tired hand had played on her these past weeks. She did not yet know that in a locked box in her father's old workshop, 3 counties away, wrapped in a letter she had been forbidden to open until her next birthday, or her wedding day, whichever came first, lay the answer to a question she had not yet learned to ask. She learned to ask it 4 days later, on a night when a summer storm kept her from Rivenhall's gallery, and sent her instead to her own small rented room above the printer's shop in the village, where Tobias had forwarded, with the week's other correspondence, a letter from Mrs. Prudence Ashwell. The woman Rosalind had known her whole life as her father's oldest friend, a quiet, watchful presence at the edge of every important occasion, never quite family, and never quite not. The letter was short and strange, and asked only whether Rosalind had yet had cause to open her father's box, and whether, this in a hand that had visibly trembled over the words, she would think of paying an old woman a visit before her next birthday arrived, because there were things that ought to be said aloud, by a living voice, rather than left to paper and a dead man's silence. Rosalind read it twice by candlelight, and could not, that night, have said why her hands were unsteady, folding it away. She only knew, with the same wordless certainty that had been misdirecting her brush for a month, that some door in her life she had never known was closed had just been quietly, deliberately set ajar, and that she was not yet ready to walk through it, though she suspected, she was already beginning to suspect, that it would not wait much longer for her courage to catch up to it. The 7th sitting fell 3 days after the storm, and the Duke, who had spent the intervening time turning over a question he could not quite make himself ask directly, chose instead to ask it sideways, in the manner of a man more comfortable with strategy than with sentiment. "You said your father painted for the Alderman of Bath," he said, midway through the session, apropos of nothing that had come before it. "Did he ever paint further afield? The border counties, perhaps. Denholm way." Rosalind's brush did not so much as pause, though the question landed somewhere just beneath her ribs, and stayed there. "My father travelled a great deal before I was old enough to remember it clearly," she said, which was true. He rarely spoke of particular commissions. He believed a portraitist ought to keep his patron's business as private as their physicians did. A commendable philosophy. The Duke's eyes, hazel, warm, entirely his own, and yet she found her hand, drifting toward the grey again, even as they spoke, rested on her, with an attention that felt, for the first time, less like scrutiny of her craft and more like scrutiny of her. It occurs to me, Mr. Colford, that I know remarkably little about the man holding the brush, for all that I've sat still under his gaze 8 separate afternoons. There is little to know. I paint. I keep my father's accounts current and his reputation intact. I have very little life outside of it. Everyone has a life outside of it, he said. Even, I begin to suspect, dukes. He held her gaze a moment longer than strict business required, and Rosalind felt, not for the first time, the peculiar vertigo of being truly looked at by a man who noticed everything and said only a careful fraction of it aloud. You'll forgive me. I find I've grown curious about you in a way that has very little to do with the portrait. That would be unwise, Your Grace. Undoubtedly, he agreed, without the smallest sign of being deterred by his own agreement, and Rosalind understood, with a small internal lurch that had nothing to do with grey pigment and everything to do with the plain fact of him, that the danger she had been so carefully guarding against, discovery of her sex, her false name, her father's careful fraud, had just quietly acquired a second, more personal front, and that she had no idea, yet, which one would cost her more to lose. She went to Prudence Ashwell's cottage on the one full day Rivenhall granted her between sittings, riding the 6 miles on a hired mare, with her heart beating harder than the pace of the road accounted for, and found the old woman waiting at her own gate, as though she'd been watching the lane since dawn. Prudence had aged since Elias's funeral, smaller, greyer, her hands, when she took Rosalind's in both of hers at the gate, trembling with something that was not entirely the palsy of age. She said nothing at first, beyond the ordinary courtesies, ushered Rosalind inside, to a low-beamed parlour, smelling of dried lavender and wood smoke, poured tea neither of them drank, and then sat across from her, twisting her apron in her lap, for long enough that Rosalind finally said, gently, "You wrote that there was something to be said aloud." "I wrote a great many things I didn't have the courage to finish saying, once you were sat in front of me." Prudence's eyes, pale and rheumy with age, fixed on Rosalind's face with an intensity that made the girl want to look away and did not let her. "You've his colouring, Elias's I mean, the same brown to your hair, near enough, the same set to your chin when you're vexed. He wasn't lying, all those years, when he let people take you for his own. He never once lied outright. He simply let the silence do the lying for him, and I helped him do it, because I gave my word to a dying woman, and I have never in 30 years found the courage to decide that word had run its course." Rosalind's teacup had gone still in her hand. Prudence. "I was lady's maid to the Countess of Denholm," the old woman said, all in a rush now, as though the sentence had been dammed up so long it came out with the force of a breach. "Lady Evelina, the sweetest, gentlest soul I ever served, and I served her 12 years, through her marriage and through the one child she managed to carry to term after 4 that she lost, and I was in the house the night the fire took hold, and I am the only living soul who knows that it did not take her daughter with her, because I carried that daughter out through a servant's passage myself, wrapped in my own shawl, while every other soul in that house believed both mother and infant lost." The parlour had gone very quiet. Somewhere outside, a bird was singing as though nothing in the world had shifted, and Rosalind sat with her cold tea and felt the floor of her own life tilt slowly, irrevocably, beneath her. "Why," she said, when she could make her voice work, "would you not simply bring the child home?" Because home, by then, was not safe for her. Prudence's mouth thinned. The Earl's own cousin, Mr. Renfrew, stood to inherit the whole of the Denholm estate the moment there was no direct heir left breathing, and he was already, before that fire had so much as gone cold, asking a great many careful questions about how thoroughly the nursery had burned. I did not trust him with a dying woman's daughter. I did not trust anyone in that house, in that hour. So I walked 3 days with an infant who would not stop crying until I found a kind stranger with a painter's cart and an empty seat, and a face I decided, on no evidence but a mother's desperate instinct, that I could trust. Elias Colford asked me no questions I was not prepared to answer honestly, and a great many I was grateful he never asked at all. You gave me to him. I gave you to the only man in 3 counties I believed would love you, without once asking what you'd cost him to keep. Prudence's hand, when it closed over Rosalind's, was shaking badly now. Your name is Rosalind. That much, at least, was never a lie. Your mother chose it herself, the week you were born, before any of the rest of it happened. Rosalind Denholm, your father, your true father, is the Earl of Denholm, and so far as I have ever been able to learn in 22 years of careful, frightened silence, he believes to this day that he buried you both. Rosalind sat very still, turning the shape of her own name over in her mind, as though it belonged to a stranger she had only just been introduced to. The eyes, she said finally, half to herself. The eyes I keep painting wrong. They aren't wrong at all, are they? What eyes, child? There's a portrait at Rivenhall, unfinished, unsigned, hung where no one would think to look for it. A woman with grey eyes, ringed in gold. Rosalind's voice had gone strange to her own ears, thin and careful, the way it went when she was holding something too large to drop. The Duke told me her name 4 days ago. Lady Evelina Denholm. I felt it land in me like a stone into water, and I told myself it was nothing, because I had no earthly reason to feel anything at all. Prudence's face, already pale, went the color of old linen. Your father kept a study, she said. Elias, I mean, your father in every way that mattered. He painted your mother's portrait himself, the year before you were born, at Lady Evelina's own request, because she'd taken a fancy to his honest hand, and did not want the flattering nonsense the fashionable London men would have given her. He never finished it. The commission was overtaken by her confinement, and then by the fire, and he never had the heart, after, to complete a dead woman's likeness for a house that no longer knew she'd had a daughter to leave it to. But he kept a study of the eyes, just the eyes, on a small board, because he said, I remember him saying it, the one time he ever spoke of her to me, that a face could be forgotten but a true color, once mixed correctly, never quite left the hand that had mixed it. He had me copy it, Rosalind said, and heard her own voice crack, finally, on the last word. For years, as a child, he told me it was an exercise in patience. He never told me whose eyes they were. He couldn't. Prudence's hand tightened over hers, fierce now, urgent. Rosalind, listen to me, because I am old and frightened, and I have wanted, every single day since I put you into that man's arms, to be brave enough to say this sooner. Your father, Elias, did not simply take in an orphaned infant out of charity, though God knows he had charity enough to spare. He knew whose child you were. I told him, that first night, everything, because I could not carry it alone and live, and he made the same choice I made, for the same reason, that a girl who was safe and unknown was better than a girl who was known and in danger. He taught you to paint your own mother's eyes, because some part of him could not bear for the last true likeness of her to die with him unspoken. He gave you the truth in the only language he trusted not to get you killed. There was a locked box, Prudence said, that Elias had left with his solicitor rather than in the workshop, to be delivered to Rosalind on her 23rd birthday or her wedding day, whichever came first. a birthday now 11 weeks away, containing a christening bracelet with the Denholm crest worked into its clasp, the original unfinished portrait study itself, and a letter in Elias's own hand explaining everything Prudence had just spoken aloud. Written, he had told Prudence once, so that if my courage runs out before hers does, the truth will still find her eventually, in ink, if not in a living voice. Then it's already decided, Rosalind said slowly. Whether I want it decided or not, 11 weeks. It's decided whenever you choose to open it, Prudence said. Not a moment sooner. I would have gone to my own grave without saying a word if I hadn't seen, in your last letter, that you were already painting her eyes onto a stranger's face without knowing why. Your hand knew before your mind did, child. It generally does, in people like you and your father both. I only thought you deserved to know why, before it cost you something you weren't prepared to pay. Rosalind rode the 6 miles back to her lodgings in a fog she could not afterward clearly remember, her mind turning over the same handful of facts in an endless, exhausted circuit. A mother she had never known, a father who might, this very hour, still be alive and unaware of her, a cousin whose careful questions about a burned nursery had sounded, 22 years later, uncomfortably like the same careful curiosity Hollis Renfrew had turned on her in the Rivenhall gallery. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead at her narrow window with a scrap of paper and a stick of charcoal, and without entirely deciding to, drew the grey eyes from memory, not from the small board above her father's workbench, which she had copied so many times the shapes lived in her hand, independent of thought, but from the unfinished portrait in Rivenhall's alcove, adding to it, for the first time, a small detail neither study had shown her, and that she could not have invented, a scar, barely a hair's width, through the left eyebrow, the kind a woman might carry from a childhood fall no one thought to mention in the family history. She stared at the drawing for a long time before she understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air, that she had not invented that scar at all. She had remembered it, in the wordless, bodily way an infant remembers a face bent low over a cradle, long before memory has learned to keep proper records. She returned to Rivenhall the following week, outwardly unchanged, and inwardly rearranged down to the foundations, and if the Duke noticed a new carefulness in her, a longer pause before she answered simple questions, a habit of watching his face with something closer to searching than study, he said nothing of it directly, though she caught him, twice in that first sitting, looking at her with the particular stillness of a man doing careful arithmetic he did not yet trust enough to say aloud. "You've changed the underpainting again," he observed, on the 9th sitting, studying the half-formed canvas with his head tilted. "I have." "Grey," he said. "Still grey." He did not phrase it as a question, and something in his voice made Rosalind's hand still entirely on the brush. "I've been thinking about that portrait in the gallery. About Lady Evelina. My mother wrote to her, in the last year of her own life, 3 letters that were returned unopened, addressed to a solicitor's office in the north, a solicitor who, when I finally thought to write and ask after him myself last spring, informed me with considerable discomfort that his firm no longer handled the estate's business and could not, in good conscience, say more. I had assumed, until a fortnight ago, that this was simply the ordinary tangle of old family business, best left undisturbed. I no longer assume that. "Why tell me this?" "Because you painted her eyes onto my face 4 times, running before either of us understood why, Mr. Colford, and I have never in my life believed in coincidence enough to trust one that persistent." His gaze, when it found hers, had lost the last of its careful distance. What was left was something rawer, more direct, closer to the man Mrs. Yardley had once described as harder to read than a locked ledger. "I don't yet know what I'm looking at." I intend to find out. I would ask that whatever you know, and I begin to suspect you know a great deal more than you've said, you tell me before someone with less patience and worse intentions decides to make use of it first." She thought, in that moment, of Hollis Renfrew's cold, assessing eyes in the gallery doorway, of his idle, pointed question about whether Elias Colford had ever mentioned a son, and understood with sudden sick clarity that the Duke's warning had come later than it should have. "I need a little more time," she said. "Not because I don't trust you, because I don't yet trust the ground I'm standing on." "Take the time," he said, after a moment, though something in his face suggested the concession cost him. "But take it quickly. I have learned, in 11 years of managing an estate full of other people's secrets, that the ones which frighten a good woman into silence are rarely the ones that can afford to wait." Hollis Renfrew, meanwhile, had not been idle. He had ridden to the north within a day of his encounter with Rosalind in the Rivenhall gallery, ostensibly to see to a boundary dispute on land that bordered his own modest holding, and had spent the better part of a week instead making quiet, careful inquiries. A word here to an old solicitor's clerk he had once bribed, and could bribe again. A word there to a physician long retired from attending the Denholm household, gathering the scattered threads of a fear that had lain dormant in him for over 2 decades, and had, in the space of one gallery conversation, woken entirely. He learned that a portrait painter calling himself Colford had lately taken a commission at Rivenhall. He learned, from the retired physician, that the same Colford who had once painted the young Lady Evelina Denholm had, some months before that lady's death, been seen leaving the Denholm estate with a woman known to be the Countess's own maid, a woman since vanished from every record he could find, save one, a Prudence Ashwell, still, by all accounts, resident within riding distance of Rivenhall itself. He did not yet have proof of anything so specific as a living heir. He had, worse for his peace of mind, something close enough to smell it. A resemblance he had seen with his own eyes, a name that would not stay buried, a maid who had vanished at precisely the hour a nursery burned, and precisely nowhere since. 22 years of careful management, of stewarding an aging earl's affairs with an authority that had gradually, comfortably, become indistinguishable from ownership, of debts quietly settled from Denholm coffers no one thought closely enough to question. All of it rested, he understood with a cold clarity that kept him awake 3 nights running, on the continued and total absence of the Earl's true daughter. He resolved, before he had fully admitted to himself what he was resolving to do, that the absence would remain total, whatever the cost of ensuring it. The cost, when he settled on it, was reputation, hers, not his own, since his own had 2 decades of comfortable insulation behind it, and hers had nothing at all. He arrived at Rivenhall for the unveiling of the finished ducal portrait, an event the Duke had, against his own inclination, been persuaded by his aunt to make into something of an occasion, with half the county's notable families gathered in the long gallery to see the new Duke's likeness hung beside his father's, with a story already assembled and an audience already gathered to receive it. "A remarkable piece," Renfrew said, loudly enough to carry, standing before the draped canvas with a glass of the Duke's own claret in hand, while Rosalind stood nearby in the plain, dark coat she wore for professional occasions, feeling suddenly, unaccountably exposed. "Though I confess myself curious, Rivenhall, whether you've had the painter's credentials properly examined. I made inquiries of my own, you understand. One grows cautious, in these uncertain times, about who is permitted access to a great house and a great family's likeness." He turned, with the theatrical slowness of a man who had rehearsed his cruelty, to address the assembled room rather than the Duke directly. "It appears our Mr. Colford is no gentleman's son, carrying on an honest trade at all, but a woman, Elias Colford's own daughter, if my sources are correct, going about the county for 2 years now in her father's clothes and her father's name, deceiving patrons of quality into believing they'd engaged a man's steady hand. I wonder what else, in that case, we ought to doubt about her work, or her character. The room's low conversational hum died all at once, replaced by a silence that felt, to Rosalind, like the moment before a held breath becomes a scream. She was aware of faces turning toward her, some merely curious, some already hardening into the particular contempt reserved for a woman caught at something she was not meant to attempt, and aware, with a distant, ringing clarity, that Renfrew had chosen his moment with real precision. A room full of witnesses, a duke with his own reputation now entangled in hers, and no time at all for her to prepare a defense. I have not lied about my sex to secure a single commission, Rosalind said, into the silence, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. I have signed my father's name to my father's trade, because a guild that would not admit me left me no other honest way to keep bread on my table, and his memory intact. If that is a crime, sir, it is one committed by every widow who has ever kept her husband's shop running under his sign, rather than watch it close. A charming defense, Renfrew said, unmoved, though it rather dodges the more interesting question, doesn't it? Why a portrait painter's shabby little household in Bath should have any connection at all to the affairs of the Denholm earldom. I understand your father once painted the late Countess of Denholm. I understand, further, that the Countess's maid, a Mrs. Prudence Ashwell, I believe, has been seen visiting your lodgings with some regularity these past years. One begins to wonder what, precisely, an itinerant painter and a runaway lady's maid might have had occasion to discuss so privately, and so often, for 2 decades running. His eyes found Rosalind's, and for the first time, she saw, beneath the theatre, the genuine fear driving it, the fear of a man who had built a comfortable life on a grave he was no longer certain was empty. I wonder, Mr. Colford, Miss Colford, whether you've ever asked yourself precisely why you paint grey eyes onto every face you're given, whether the sitter's own eyes are grey or not. I understand it's become something of a habit with you. The Duke, who had stood silent through the whole of this performance, with an expression of such controlled stillness that Rosalind had briefly feared he was simply absorbing the scandal to his own advantage, moved at last, stepping between Renfrew and the room's assembled gaze, with the unhurried authority of a man who had never in his life needed to raise his voice to command a space. You will forgive me, Renfrew, he said, if I find your sudden interest in my portraitist's parentage considerably more suspicious than her parentage itself. A man does not spend a week riding to solicitors' offices and retired physicians out of idle curiosity. He does so because he is frightened of what an honest inquiry might turn up. His gaze swept the room, cool and level, before returning to Renfrew with something harder underneath it. You have accused this woman, in my own house, before my own guests, of deception. I find myself wondering what you stand to lose, precisely, if the deception runs the other direction, if it is not her presence here that threatens something, but yours. I don't know what you imagine you're suggesting, Your Grace. I am suggesting, the Duke said, that we send for Mrs. Prudence Ashwell tonight, by my own carriage, and ask her directly what she knows. If there is nothing to it, sir, you will have the satisfaction of watching me apologize to you in front of every witness in this room. If there is something to it, I expect you already know precisely what shape that something takes, and precisely why you'd rather it be spoken of as scandal in a gallery than sworn as testimony before a magistrate. Renfrew's composure, for the first time in the whole encounter, visibly cracked. This is absurd theatre over an old woman's fancies. Then you won't object to her being asked, the Duke said, and turned, before Renfrew could assemble a further objection to summon his own coachman. Prudence Ashwell arrived at Rivenhall a little past 9 that evening, brought by the Duke's own carriage and escorted through the front entrance rather than the servants' door, a small courtesy that was not lost on her and that steadied, visibly, the tremor in her hands as she was shown into the long gallery, where the county's assembled families still waited, half in genuine concern for a scandal unfolding, and half in the frank appetite of people who understood they were about to witness something they would repeat at every dinner table in the county for a decade. She did not wait to be formally questioned. She had clearly spent the carriage ride assembling her own courage, and she spent it now, standing very small and very straight before the room, with her eyes fixed not on Renfrew, who watched her with an expression gone entirely bloodless, but on Rosalind. "My name is Prudence Ashwell," she said, "and for 12 years I was lady's maid to Evelina, Countess of Denholm. God rest her patient soul. On the night of the fire that took her life 22 years ago, I carried her infant daughter out of that burning house myself, alive and unharmed, and I told every soul who asked me afterward that the child had died with her mother, because I did not trust the man standing in this room tonight, nor his ambitions toward an estate that was never rightfully his to inherit, while a direct heir still breathed. Her voice, though it shook, did not falter. I gave that child into the keeping of a portrait painter named Hollis Colford, a man of more honest goodness than any lord I ever served, and I have spent every year since watching her grow into a woman I am prouder of than I have any right to claim credit for, and lying to her, and to everyone, about who she truly was, because I believed, I still believe, that the truth would have been a death sentence the moment it left my mouth in the wrong company. She turned, finally, to face Renfrew directly. "You made those inquiries in the north, sir, because some part of you has known for 22 years that the fire took a mother and left the child living, and you have spent every year since praying no one would ever think to look closely enough to prove it. I am done being frightened into silence on your account. Rosalind Colford is Rosalind Denholm, the true and only daughter of Bertram, Earl of Denholm, and I will swear that testimony before any magistrate in England, whatever it costs me." The silence that followed had a different quality entirely from the one Renfrew's accusation had produced. Not the anticipatory hush of scandal about to break, but the heavier, stiller silence of a room absorbing something true. Rosalind stood very still at its center, aware of the Duke's hand coming to rest, briefly, warm and steadying, against her lower back, aware of 200 years of painted Calthorpes watching from the walls, aware most of all of the strange, vertiginous relief of having a truth she had carried alone for 11 weeks, suddenly made solid by another living voice. "This is a fabrication," Renfrew said, but the words came out thin, unconvincing even to his own ear, and the room's collective gaze, the same gaze that had, 20 minutes earlier, hung on his every accusation, had already begun to turn, with the swift and merciless recalibration of society, witnessing a reversal, entirely against him. "It will be a simple enough matter to determine," the Duke said, "whether it's fabrication or fact. There is, I understand, a christening bracelet, and a letter in Hollis Colford's own hand, held by his solicitor against the day Miss Colford turned 23, or married, whichever came first. I propose we send for both, tonight, along with the family physician who attended Lady Evelina's confinement, if he can still be found and still draws breath. And I propose, Renfrew, that you remain in this house until the matter is settled, since I find I have a great many questions of my own about a fire that conveniently cleared an inheritance into your hands, and about which solicitors' offices you found it necessary to visit so urgently the very week a resemblance first caught your attention. Mr. Pemberton, The family solicitor, whom the Duke's own man roused from his bed before midnight, arrived with Elias Colford's box intact, its seal unbroken, and it was opened at last, not in some private chamber, but there in the long gallery, before the same assembly that had watched the accusation and the defense both, because Rosalind, when the Duke asked her, quietly, whether she wished it done privately, found she no longer wanted this truth to live in shadow at all. The bracelet was small, tarnished silver, sized for an infant's wrist, engraved with a crest Mr. Pemberton confirmed within moments as the Denholm arms. The letter, when Rosalind's hands proved too unsteady to break its seal, and the Duke asked, without being asked, whether he might do it for her, was in Elias Colford's plain, careful hand, and said everything Prudence had already said aloud, and one thing more, a final line, added, by the date, only weeks before his death, as though he had known his own time was running short, and wanted his daughter to have, at the very end, not only the facts, but his blessing to claim them. I have loved you as my own for 22 years, and nothing in this letter changes that truth by so much as a hair. But you were born to be found, my Rosalind, not hidden forever, and I could not go to my grave having been the last obstacle standing between you and the rest of your life. Rosalind read that line twice, in a room gone entirely silent around her, and did not try to stop the tears that came with it, because for the first time in 11 weeks she understood that grief and truth were not, after all, opposed to one another. The Earl of Denholm was brought to Rivenhall 4 days later, too frail now to travel easily, and helped from his carriage by 2 servants, a man whose face had gone still and grey with a grief he had carried, unrelieved, for over 2 decades. He was shown into the small morning room where Rosalind waited, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, disbelief giving slow, trembling way to something too large for a single word. Evelina's eyes, he said finally, his voice breaking entirely on his dead wife's name. You have Evelina's eyes. I'm told they're a fault in my hand, Rosalind said, through her own tears, when I try to paint anyone else's. He crossed the room slower than his eagerness clearly wanted him to move, his old joints protesting every step, and took her face between 2 trembling hands, and studied her, not as a stranger examining a claim, but as a father finally allowed to look, and found, just where Rosalind had drawn it from memory weeks before without understanding why, the faint hairline scar through her left eyebrow that no forger, no impostor, no careful fabrication could have known to invent. Your mother gave you that scar herself, he said, laughing and weeping in the same broken breath, the week before she died, fussing over you in your cradle, and catching your brow with the edge of her own ring. She cried over it for a full day, certain she'd scarred you for life, and I told her, I remember it as though it were spoken this morning, that it would only ever be proof, some day, of how fiercely she'd loved you. He pressed his lips, trembling, to her forehead, exactly over the scar, and said, in a voice gone entirely unsteady, I buried you both. I have grieved you both for 22 years. Tell me this is not a dream I will wake from disappointed. It isn't, Rosalind said, and let her father, her true father, restored to her at last, after a lifetime neither of them had known was incomplete, hold her the way she had never, in 23 years, been held. Hollis Renfrew did not wait for the magistrate's formal inquiry to conclude before he fled the county in the night, leaving behind him, when the Earl's own solicitors finally examined the estate's books in full, a trail of quietly diverted funds 2 decades deep, more than sufficient on its own to see him prosecuted the moment he could be found. He was apprehended 8 weeks later, attempting to take passage from Bristol under an assumed name, and stood trial the following spring on charges of fraud, theft, and obstruction of a lawful inheritance. His careful 22 years of borrowed respectability collapsing, in the end, in considerably less time than it had taken him to build. It was a full month after the truth had settled, both legally and quietly into the ordinary rhythm of days, before the Duke asked Rosalind to finish the portrait he had first commissioned her to paint. Not the formal likeness meant to hang beside his father's, which had been completed weeks before and hung now in the long gallery to general admiration, but a second, smaller canvas he brought to her himself, unannounced, in the workshop she had reopened under her own true name. It was the little board her father had left her, the practice study, 2 grey eyes ringed in gold, that had sat above Elias Colford's workbench for as long as she could remember, and above her own since his death. The Duke set it on her easel beside a blank, prepared canvas, and said, with none of the careful control she had grown so used to hearing in his voice, "I should like a matched portrait. Your mother's eyes, finished properly at last, and beside them, if you'll permit the vanity, my own, painted correctly, this time, by a hand that I understand now was never actually mistaken about a single grey stroke it laid down. You want me to finish it?" "I want a great many things," he said, "and I have found myself extraordinarily patient in the pursuit of very few of them in my life. I find I am not patient about this one at all." He took her hand, paint-stained and unsteady, in both of his. "I have watched you for 3 months paint the truth into a face, before either of us understood what we were looking at. I would like the rest of my life to watch you paint whatever you please, under whatever name you choose to sign, as my wife, if you will have a man who took considerably longer to notice what his own eyes were plainly showing him than any portrait painter ever should have." "I got your eyes wrong, every single time," Rosalind said, laughing through sudden tears, "and it turned out to be the truest thing I ever painted." "Then I hope you'll forgive me," the Duke said, "if I ask you to spend the next 50 years painting me exactly that wrong, over and over, until neither of us can quite remember which eyes were ever meant to be the correction." She said yes, with her hand still faintly trembling, still smelling of linseed oil, and finished both portraits. Her mother's eyes completed at last after 22 years of patient, unknowing practice, and the Duke's own beside them, painted finally in the exact storm grey her hand had insisted upon from the very first sitting, before the wedding took place that autumn in the small church at Rivenhall, with the Earl of Denholm, too frail to stand the whole ceremony, but too joyful to be persuaded to sit through it either, giving his recovered daughter away. The months that followed folded the whole of Rosalind's scattered family, blood and chosen both, into a single settled piece. Prudence Ashwell was given a cottage on the Denholm estate itself, and a standing invitation to Rivenhall's table whenever she cared to take it, and spent her remaining years, by her own frequent report, entirely too comfortable for a woman who had once run 3 days across open country with a stolen infant and nothing else to her name. Tobias completed a formal apprenticeship under Rosalind's own instruction and opened, within 4 years, a modest but respected practice of his own in Bath, proud beyond all reasonable measure of the small brass plate by his door, reading simply, "T. Ashwell, portraitist," a surname he had asked Prudence's leave to take, and been granted, with tears neither of them bothered pretending not to shed. Mrs. Yardley remained housekeeper at Rivenhall long enough to see the first of Rosalind and Edwin's children christened in the same small church, and never once, in all the years after, let anyone in that house forget that she had known the new Duchess was somebody the very first afternoon she walked in, smaller than a Colford ought to be. Mr. Pemberton oversaw the full legal restoration of Rosalind's inheritance, and the quiet unwinding of Renfrew's 2 decades of mismanagement, with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who clearly relished, after a lifetime of dull conveyancing, one genuinely satisfying case. Mr. Egerton Price, the rival portraitist who had once called at Rosalind's shop hoping to find Colford's daughter reduced to selling off her father's easel, sent, upon hearing the news of her true parentage and her forthcoming marriage, an uncharacteristically gracious letter of congratulation, along with a standing request to view her work whenever she cared to show it, a request Rosalind, with the particular satisfaction of the formerly underestimated, answered exactly once a year, and never with her best pieces. The old Earl lived 4 more years, long enough to see a grandson born and christened with his own name, and spent every one of those years, by every account, entirely undone with quiet joy each time his daughter walked into a room. The little board of painted eyes that had started it all, finished at last, hung ever after in the Rivenhall gallery, beside the completed portrait of Lady Evelina Denholm, no longer unsigned, no longer shadowed in an overlooked alcove, but given pride of place opposite the formal ducal likeness, so that anyone walking the length of that gallery would pass, in the space of a few unhurried steps, a mother, a daughter, and the husband who had finally learned to see them both clearly. Love, Rosalind would say in later years, to whichever of her children asked how their parents had come to marry, is not always announced. Sometimes it is only a hand that keeps insisting, quietly and against all instruction, on a truth the rest of you hasn't caught up to yet. And the wisest thing anyone can do, when they notice it happening, is not to correct it, but to ask why. If a story like hers is one you'd want more of, you know precisely what to do. Tell us in the comments which portrait you'd have painted first, and subscribe so the next one finds you.